Happy Father's Day. Our reading in the scripture today is Psalm 8, and it can be found on page 427 in your pew Bibles. It is a psalm of David. In this psalm, David speaks of the glory of God and how the glory of man reflects upon God. And I would suggest as we read, let us read as David, because this is written in the first person. I will begin, and you will read the even numbers, and we will say the 9th verse together. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? Yet you have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet. All sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the fields. The birds of the air, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. May God bless to us this reading.
We'll see how long we can make it without the chicken driving us out of here. We'll see. That smell. So this week, someone reminded me, that question that I posed last week of how are you getting settled? Like, how are you and your family getting settled? That still hasn't changed that much. Now the way it was posed to me this week is like, now that you've been here for a minute, now that you've kind of gotten settled, that you've had a good week where you've been in the community, like, how are things going now? And so I started to kind of make a checklist in my mind. And as someone who's kind of a big picture kind of person, it's very helpful for me to have like a checklist. It makes me feel like I'm accomplishing something. So this past week, as that person kind of posed that question, I began to think, like, what was I able to check off that list this week? And, I just realized that some things are just easier to get done than others. And as much as I complained about like unpacking boxes and how you're trying to find new places for old things, it's the other things that sometimes you think are going to be really easy to do that take forever. You can ask Judy this week. I had to send Judy a text in the middle of the afternoon, and I was like, hey, can you show me how to use the fax machine? Because I'm trying to, I needed a divine miracle in order to get transcripts sent from one doctor's office to another so that you can get insurance situated. Things that are supposed to be real simple are just not. So in the transition of trying to check things off of like new car insurance, the new medical insurance, trying to get new license plates, it's been just it's been an anxiety-driven kind of thing. It's a stressor. It's something that causes it pretty easy. And one of those things, I have to confess this morning that I just haven't had time to do. And I don't know if this is something that you've been through. I don't know if you have moved into this area or had to go away and had this happen while you're there. I have anxiety around finding a new barber. I know it sounds silly, but as you can tell, this is like a real deal. This is a complete package, right? This takes a lot of work. So I've been thinking, I had a really good barber back in Winston, and so I've been kind of like, I got like tails now back here. I just haven't had my hair cut in a while. And so I have a little anxiety around that. And so as I was just beginning to think about that this week, and the idea of Trinity Sunday and this concept of community, I begin to think that this beard has really, this hair, particularly the beard, has really allowed me to enter into spaces and have conversations with people in different communities that I never thought I would have gotten the chance to. I'll give you an example. So several years ago, Lauren has always known me with facial hair, but it was not as prominent as it is now. And so we had a mutual friend, and I was growing my beard out, and she said, you would really probably get a kick out of this TV show called Whisker Wars. I was like, okay, there's reality TV for anything, right? Like anything. So I went home and found it, I think it was on Amazon Prime or something, and I watched this show, and it was all about these grown men who would go to these beard competitions. And the best way I can describe that is if you've ever seen Toddlers and Tiaras or been to a beauty pageant, it's like that, but with really grown hairy men. I mean, that's the same kind of concept. So I thought this was a riot, and so I began to look up to see if there was any competitions around me, and there were. And so Lauren and I, we just started attending them, and we got to know some of the people there, and it really kind of blossomed into something completely different for us. We even started a beard club in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we got to do some charity work, and it was just a really good thing. But I can remember one of the first times I went to those competitions, and you kind of know people through social media. And so I got to meet this one guy, and we were beside each other in line, and we're getting ready to go up on a stage. I mean, it's just like a competition. You go across, and there's different categories. And so me and this guy are in the same category together, and we're waiting to go up, and we're talking about stuff. And we know each other, but we don't really know each other, right? So we begin to have this conversation, and he is just... let's see, how would I put this? He is just cursing up a storm. Like every other word he's like dropping a bomb about something. And of course, I don't say anything. I'm just kind of like talking to him and laughing and kind of pointing out stuff. And then it comes my turn to get up on the stage, and I walk across, and the MC who's hosting the event mentions that I'm a minister or a reverend. So I get down, don't think anything about it, and I walk off into the distance, into the sunset, and later that evening, that young man comes up to me and he says, I want to apologize to you. I didn't know you were a pastor. I wouldn't have said that stuff in front of you. And so it really began a really good conversation. It was this two cultures meeting, this kind of perceived church culture that he thought I was from, and this beard community, which can be a little rough around the edges. And so we got to talk about that, and I was able to share with him. I was like, I'm glad you could talk the way you want to talk in front of me. I want your authentic self. I don't want a projection of who you want me to think that you are. I'm not that kind of pastor. And, I kind of believe that we are simultaneously sinners and saints at the same time, that we are saints under construction. And, I still struggle, even being a pastor. I heard one old Baptist pastor say once that he's like, before I was saved, I used to cuss at the drop of a hat. And now I wait till the hat drops before I curse. So it's with that kind of thing. But I had this really good moment with him of sharing that. But as I left, I began to realize, because this was a little early in my ministry as well, is that when people found out who I was or what my title was, it changed the course of our conversation. It had the potential to alter the conversation, sometimes in a funny way, like with this young man, and it was a good growing experience. But then other times, not so much. Sometimes when people would find out that I'm a pastor, and I've kind of learned to not give that information as freely as first, not because I'm ashamed of it, but just because I know it carries with it sometimes good and bad connotations. For some people, when they find out I'm a pastor, they may associate me with something that happened earlier in their life that was not pleasurable. A bad experience either they experienced in church or something that happened to their family, and they begin to withdraw. And so a conversation gets cut really short. Even within Baptist denominations today, they are addressing issues of sexual allegations and sexual harassment, and it happens in other Christian denominations. And so sometimes when people hear that I'm a pastor, they shut down and move on because of those stories. Other times, you think a conversation kind of blossoms into something else. I tell someone I'm a pastor, I spill the beans, I have to tell them what I do for a living, and they're like, oh, I'm a Christian too. And usually what happens, it takes a few minutes, but there usually becomes a quiz bowl that comes along with that. They want to ask a lot of questions. They want to maybe share a story, but a lot of times they try to ask me questions about where I fall on things and on certain issues. And I always think it's kind of like, it's like when you go to the fair and there's that like, you must be this tall to ride kind of thing. It's kind of like that, but meant in a really great way. They're just trying to find out more about you, but they're really trying to figure where you fall on that scale. And this, it's those determining questions of seeing, are you in this group or are you out of this group? Are you a Christian or are you not a Christian? And I think that because of the day that we're on and this shift that's taking place within the church calendar, it's a good idea of asking, what is Christian community? Not just what is Christian community, but what are Christians in a community? And what does just community mean? What does it mean to be in community with other people? And so on Trinity Sunday, I think that kind of holds water. And I'm going to tie that together because you would think, what does that have to do with what does the Trinity have to do with community? So the way the church calendar works is we are kind of coming into the second half of the church calendar. The first half, if you know anything about that practice or anything about that tradition, the church calendar kind of looks at the first half of the year. It starts later, doesn't really follow the calendar we usually follow on our day-to-day lives. But what happens in the beginning is you have Advent and then you have the Ascension, and really it kind of goes all through that. And it's really the life and work of Jesus. You just kind of see that in the first part, and then at Trinity Sunday, you're on the heels of Pentecost. You see something shift, something changes, and the focus, while it's always about God, and it's always about Jesus, always about the Spirit, but it changes to that of the work of the church. And that becomes a major focus. And they don't give it a very special name. They just call it ordinary time. And ordinary time is a long time, but it really deals with this idea of, it kind of pays homage to what the early church, the mothers and fathers of our faith, how they come to understand themselves in this new community that the Holy Spirit kind of ushers in. And so this recognition of Trinity Sunday, it's important because it points to the community. It points us back to these early communities that we get to kind of see within the New Testament. We get to see what, the church at Philippi was going through. We get to see what the church in Rome was going through. We get to see what was happening at the church in Corinth and in Ephesus. We get to see what was going on with these people? How was the church growing, not just by numbers, but like spiritually? What were the things that they were dealing with as a community? And again, what does all that have to do with the triune God? That's one of those big words that we talk about, triune, the 3-in-1. That gets really sticky and really tricky pretty early. So when you talk about the Trinity and you talk about community, I think we can kind of get hung up on a lot of things. The Trinity is something that I have seen being in seminary and being in school. The Trinity can fill up a bookshelf full of stuff. Systematic theology. People can write for days about it, and usually when they write that, you can't understand it. It's all over the place, or it's so precise that you start getting God in the box again, right? It's like that. So it can be very in-depth. And then I've seen the Trinity explained simply, like in a children's message. People talk about the Trinity as something as like what's a great example of like water. It's all water, but it's gas, it's a liquid, and it's a solid. And so they present the Trinity that way. I always liked it. Again, I didn't grow up in church, but when I got older, I heard the example of the Trinity being like ice cream. You guys have heard that one? Like Neapolitan ice cream. It's chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, God the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, but it's all ice cream, so it's all good. And I always liked that because usually when they told you that, they gave you ice cream, and it was just a good experience. It was a good way to kind of get the kids on the Trinity train, But what I see is that when people talk about the Trinity, when they talk about that, it gets complicated, and it gets to be what we were talking about a minute ago, a very divisive thing. It becomes about more doctrinal issues and the who's in and who's out over certain beliefs. And, in my experience, that doesn't really do well for people. It doesn't really speak to people. It doesn't edify people. It doesn't build them up. I think the Trinity can be both in-depth and simple, and it can show us things about community. And I think it can do that in a beautiful way. So Malcolm Guite is a poet. He's also an Anglican priest, and he writes these. I want you to hear these words that he says about the Trinity. In the beginning, not in space or time, but in the quick before space and time, in life and love, in co-inherent grace, in 3-in-1 and 3-in-rhyme. In music, in the whole creation story, in his own imagination, or in his own image, his imagination, the triune poet makes us for his glory and makes us each the other's inspiration. He calls out of darkness, chaos, and chance to improvise a music of our own, to sing the chord that calls us to the dance, 3 notes resounding from a single tone. To sing the end in whom all into all we begin, our God beyond, beside us, and within. It's those last lines that I really like, that really kind of hit home for me, the Trinity, beyond, beside us, and within. And so what I like about that, and when I first read Malcolm Guite, what it did, it pointed me to a part of the Trinity that I think we miss, and this is where it kind of touches base with community. When you get to doctrinal issues around the Trinity, a lot of time people like to focus on the three separate manifestations, the three separate identities of Christ, or identities of God. So you have God the Father, and God the Father has to be over here, and God the Son's got to be over here, and God the Spirit has to be down here. And so when you deal with those, you only deal with one of those at a time. And I see that that's been a tradition that's been passed on, but I don't know. I like kind of breaking traditions a little bit and pushing back and trying to expanding on things. So I think maybe instead of just looking at those by themselves, maybe something important to do would be to look at how they relate to one another and to look at the space in between God the Father and God the Son. Because if you do that, then it becomes not just about an individual. It's not becomes about a singular thing. Really, the Trinity represents how to be in relationship with one another. What does it mean for God the Son to be in relationship with God the Father? What does God the Father mean to be in relationship with God the Spirit? And so if you start to look at things that way, then all of a sudden the Trinity becomes a great example of a divine relationship and how to be in divine community with each other. And so when we see Trinity as a relationship instead of a doctrinal issue, it helps us view our own communities in better ways. And let me say, since coming to Lincoln, I think you've got community down pretty well in a lot of ways. And so one of the things I remember when we first came here, Lauren and I, we came here and Judy was showing us around, and she's like, all right, I'm going to take you around the town. I take you around the village. And then like 60 seconds later, we were around the village, and that was it. And we get in, and Lauren and I are we're literally unpacking our thoughts. And I was like, man, this is going to be something so different for us. It's really going to take the people. It's going to take the people for us to feel secure enough in making this kind of move. And you guys do that. You do that in every day, in the small things, in the things that we got to experience while we were here. And then, when we went back to North Carolina, community didn't really stop. Those relationships were already kind of there. I remember, talking to Jim, and Jim was saying, like, what can I get planted for you so that you already have something in the ground when you get up here? It needs to be weeded, but he did plant stuff for me. Like, I need to weed it. But he did start that for me. So all these things have been happening. So we already had things going on. Community and relationships were already building. And since being here, I get to see that. I get to watch that. I get to say hi to people every day. I get to invited to all these things that, even though I don't really have part in that, I don't have anything invested in that, like, people still invite me to be part of that community. So this week I got invited down. They're like, you really need to come down and see these 6th graders graduate. And I got to go down to Burnham Hall, and it was more than just immediate family. I mean, Burnham Hall was packed, and it's packed with different people. It was packed with neighbors and aunts and uncles and people that come from all over, and they all come into this moment of community to celebrate these young people. And then it was beautiful because I was like, this is something like out of like Norman Rockwell. They all left there, and they went on a hayride, and people walked beside them, affirming them and ushering in to a new stage in their life. And what a great example of what community looks like. I was so moved by that I got invited. I wanted to go the next morning to the final assembly at the Lincoln Community School, aptly named a community school. And it was not just, I witnessed not just students and parents connecting with each other, or students and teachers, but teachers, peers, connecting with each other in community and affirming and showing how much they appreciate each other. And not only did students get awards, but other teachers got awards. And it was like just a beautiful moment to watch. Being part of this community, like I get to go down to a lot of the baseball games. I can hear them from the parsonage. And I went down there, and they had this, one of the T-shirts you could wear that has Lincoln on it. And it reminded me of the old like Bad News Bears jersey. And so I really liked that. I kind of wanted one. It had that yellow. And so I was like, well, I want to get one, but I don't have any money on me. So I was talking to the lady there that was over, and she was like, don't worry about it. We'll just write your name in, and you can just bring the money whenever. In fact, you can just leave the money at the general store. You can leave it down there, and we'll get it. And I'm thinking, what kind of level of trust is this? Like, this is amazing. Like, this just doesn't happen everywhere. It just doesn't. You have to pay in advance for things. Like, who just leave my money with somebody else? It doesn't matter. That just doesn't happen all the time. And then you hear the stories. You hear the stories how this isn't something new, that community has been just an intricate part of Lincoln for so long. Last week we went downstairs and we shared these moments about how the community came together over floods and fires, and how it was not just the church that responded, but it was the people on the outside, the people that don't really consider, like people that don't find their way in the building but still consider the United Church of Lincoln their church, and how they showed up and helped rebuild. And it became this really tragic moment. It became a way for the community to connect with one another. And so I think when you look at it that way, when you find that community is done well, and it's not just about a church building, it's not just about a box, but that the people that call, it's for everybody. It's for everybody that calls Lincoln home. And I think that's where our psalm comes in this morning. Because the psalm hits on something that it's not just about humanity, and it's not just about the community that we think of as the people who are our neighbors, while that's really important, but it also expands beyond that. Who else do we share this space with? Who else do we share creation with? The psalmist reminds us that our community is bigger than we realize, that the writer tells us about how God sees not just us in relationship with God, but also a relationship with everything else that God has created. And we're talking big stuff here. We're talking cosmos big. We're talking about all the creatures that crawl and swim on this earth. It lists in the psalm, it talks about oxen, it talks about birds of the air, it talks about the fish, it talks about the earth as our common home. And I think where we have stumbled as people is that we have misread the use of dominion. I think we get kind of confused. I mean, we try to translate as best we can, and we try to get a context as best we can of what having dominion over the earth actually means. And I think there's a huge separation that we just have to acknowledge, that Middle Eastern language written 2,000, 3,000 years ago is a lot different from Americanized English today. And so when we think about the idea of what dominion means, it does not mean to have authority over something, to bend it to your will. It does not mean having the power to shape something, to break it and mold it in our own image. It does not mean that we get to just smash it and build it back the way and force it into a mold of our own desire. I think dominion instead should be viewed as stewardship, and how we co-partner with creation, and we see that we're not above creation, but a part of creation. That is our call, that we are part of a much larger community, much more than just the human race. We are residents of a common home. And so I think what has happened in those moments is that we've got some negative views of God. It's kind of warped our theology. It's warped our understanding of who God is, because when you view the Creator that way, and you view creation as just something separate than what we are, then it becomes very anthropocentric. It means that it's all about humanity, that humanity is the pinnacle of all creation, and that can get really sticky, really messy, really fast. I don't know if I want to live in a world where everything's about me. That's kind of scary. It also does a thing where it separates God from the world. It kind of puts God as this clockmaker who just steps back and sets everything spinning and is not really responsible for anything because it's up to us to do everything. It also gives this negative view of the wilderness. And it says that the things out in the woods and in those places they're dark and the world is fallen, and we need to be very careful of those things. But, I read Scripture and I don't see that. I see the wilderness as the place that, while being dangerous and where mystical, kind of crazy things can happen, it's also the place that Jesus usually went off to get away from people. He goes into the wilderness and reconnects with things, and that's where he experiences God the Father. That's where he experiences prayer and where angels meet him. That's those areas. It's in the wilderness. So maybe a better understanding, I think, would be stewardship. The coming alongside, this extending our idea of community is making it bigger so that it can include all of creation. When I became a Baptist, it was a guy by the name of Will Campbell that kind of helped me do that. Will Campbell he referred to himself as a bootleg Baptist. He was down from Mississippi, so he was another good old Southern boy kind of thing. And so he got called to a pastor at a very young age and had a call by God. And he wrote this about community. He said, community ain't something you join. You don't get voted into it. It just happens. And I think that's important because, when you show up in this world, you don't really have a lot of say on how you show up. You're just part of the community. You don't have to get voted into anything. You're just here. There's no process. It's just organic. That's just the way it kind of flows. And so he writes about that in this book, The Glad River, and he poses a new idea to community. Instead of just saying that we're in community with people, he says, let's be neighbors to each other. And I like that. I like the idea of the word neighbors, and maybe that's a better way of describing how the people of God should live in community with one another. In fact, I think maybe let's change the idea of community to that of a neighborhood. And in the first chapter of his book that I'm kind of like using this from is the Glad River. Campbell introduces two main characters, and they're called Dupes and Kingston. And they are thrown into getting to know one another in the midst of their training for war. It's right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And walking along, Kingston begins to share a very revealing story about his upbringing. And the story is intimate, and Dupes, the other character, is both intrigued and taken back by the suddenness of Kingston's vulnerability and a willingness to open up to him. And from the feel of that conversation, the anecdote was told in order to build up a level of trust. And Dupes, kind of sensing this, he starts the following dialogue with Kingston. Dupes puts his hand on the man's shoulder and turned him around, looking him directly in the eye, and he says, "Do you trust me, Kingston?" He goes, "Yes, I trust you, Dupes. Do you trust me?" He says, "Yes, I trust you." They stood shaking hands and looking each other squarely in the eye. He says, "Then are we buddies?" Kingston asked. Neither face showed any expression. "Yes, we're buddies. I'm your buddy. Are you my friend, though?" "Friend," Dupes replied. "Friend," he repeated the word, but no longer as a question, his voice dropping. "That's a stronger word. We'll have to wait and see. But we are neighbors. Like I say, we're neighbors. I know that as much." So I love this idea of being somewhere neighbor. It takes work. It means more than just proximity. It means we have to be intentional about what we do, and we have to be intentional about the relationships that are around us, and that includes all of creation that surrounds us. Because when we do this, we begin to shift our focus. We say that it's not just about how we can be good to our neighbor or someone else or others, but it allows them to be good to us. It opens up a channel of conversation. It's a relationship. It's never just one-sided. It's something else. And perhaps that's the key to the community. That's what we see in the Trinity, is that we see ourselves as neighbors to one another. And we see ourselves as neighbors to creation, and that this can form friendships with everything around us. And I don't think those friendships have to be limited to Sunday morning. And they don't have to be limited to 2 hours that we get to spend here on a certain day of the week. I think some of the most interesting moments and interesting times with neighbors and community I've had have been on the edge of places. And I think the church is a great place to come back and kind of talk about and preserve our stories. But we need to take those stories and collect more of them on these edges, because that's where I think true neighborhoodship, friendship, and community take place. Now, what does that look like? It can get pretty wild, but I think it is calling us. I think the Trinity calls us. I think being a neighbor calls us. I think it means to be someone's neighbor that we have to be a neighbor to those that don't look like us. I think we have to be those that don't think like us. We have to be those that don't love like us. We have to be those that don't speak like us. And we have to be willing to be neighbors to those that don't pray like us, and definitely that don't vote like us. We have to be neighbors to all of creation. We have to include them in the conversation as well, because we have to have no exceptions, because we do share a space with something much bigger. I think to be a good neighbor, we have to be pretty uncomfortable at times. And there's some really wonderful things that can happen in that uncomfortable space. Amen.